Let's start by telling me who you are and your affiliation.
I am Ron Formisano. I am the William T. Bryan Chair of American History at the University of Kentucky, and I've been there for 11 years. Before that, I was at the University of Florida, Clark University, and I've published in both early Republic, antebellum period, and 20th century. And my most recent book is The Tea Party, A Brief History, published by Johns Hopkins. And I got interested in it because editor friend of mine suggested it, and then I was invited to teach a course on contemporary populism in Italy for 2 months in 2011. And that grew into a little book on the Tea Party.
And which Tea Party are we talking about? We're talking about back in the 18th century, or we're talking about the modern one?
We're talking about the one that erupted in 2009 on the occasion of Barack Obama's election to the presidency. And that consists of, it's really inaccurate to say the Tea Party. There are really several Tea Parties because it exists at what's been called derisively the AstroTurf level, with corporate organizations, the Chamber of Commerce, really pumping money into the initial grassroots during the first 2 years of its existence. And then there were some grassroots organizations. There were also some Tea Party organizations that were profit-making organizations. They were PACs raising money, and they were also profit-making. There was one Tea Party, the Tea Party Express, bussed people around the country, but it wasn't a grassroots organization. It was run by a Republican political consultant out in California who'd been involved in politics for many, many, many years.
Let's talk about what are the differences between the original Tea Party
Sure.
and the current Tea Party. Is it the same? The people who are in the Tea Party now, they seem to think that they're simply reenacting the original protests from the 18th century.
Well, they are not. For one thing, while the whole idea of taxation without representation was important in generating protests during the period leading up to the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, it was one small part of things. So the Tea Party started off taxed enough already. Well, that was the big disconnect is that the destroyers of the tea, as they were called, in 1773 in Boston Harbor at Griffin's Wharf, those folks really were asserting their rights as Britons, as having the same rights as freeborn Englishmen. And that was a much larger idea. When they talked about that submitting to the East India Company's monopoly on tea as a form of slavery, they were really talking about something much broader than just taxes. And that's the big disconnect. And the other disconnect, I think, is if you look at what the Tea Party has done, this contemporary Tea Party, it has moved really away from taxes as its central theme. And if you look at the state legislatures where it's had lots of influence, sure, they all want to cut safety net funds. They want to cut any kind of public assistance programs, but they also want to reduce taxes on corporations. Not ordinary citizens, but reduce taxes on corporations. And then there's gun rights, anti-choice laws, deregulation, and that's in the interest of the corporate sponsors of the grassroots. Now, the grassroots, I think, really doesn't exist anymore. But to go back just a moment to 2009, 2010, the grassroots did exist of the Tea Party. And a major similarity between the events in Boston in the 1770s and the events in the 21st century, the major similarity is there was no single central leader of the revolutionary movement, the protest movement in Boston, or even throughout Massachusetts or other colonies. It was dispersed. There were many, many levels. There was no central organizing focus. But The same thing is true of today's tea parties, as I said before. They're networks. They're interconnected networks. They work together. One of the major groups sponsored by the Koch brothers, Koch Industries, and other came out of something that has existed for a long time, Americans for Prosperity. Freedom Works evolved out of that. When the media go to a spokesman for the Tea Party, it's very misleading because they'll go to the president of Freedom Works. Oh, by the way, a spokesman for it in the early day was the former Congressman Dick Armey, who was one of the most wired-in members of the Washington establishment and a lobbyist, and was very well paid for his being a spokesman. He was posed as this populist champion. He was anything but. So there is this similarity of many layers, many networks, no central focus. Now the grassroots is pretty much the major grassroots organization, the Tea Party Patriots. That's evolved into a political action committee, and they're raising money. They're living the corporate life, shall we say, instead of being these housewives who are, working in their kitchens. And that was true in the beginning. There really were many local people all over the country who responded to the initial protests and then the rallies. Well, by the way, they really couldn't have done it without Fox News in terms of all those original. So another huge contrast is technology, communication. A huge contrast with the 1770s and the 21st century. That's pretty obvious to everybody, I think.
Let's go back to the point you were making earlier that the difference, one of the primary differences between the two movements is that in the 18th century, the context was this British imperial empire.
Exactly.
Explain that a little bit more. How does that make it different from what the Tea Party in the modern time is all about?
Well, there's a similarity. I think there was too much emphasis placed on the recession of 2008 as a helping to birth the contemporary Tea Party. Because there's been so many surveys of Tea Party members. One thing they found out was that very few of them had lost jobs or knew anybody even that lost jobs. They were concerned about public assistance programs. In the 1770s, I do believe there was a sense, this is the similar, and it's a conditioning, more of a long-term cause. There was a sense of economic insecurity. I do think the contemporary Tea Partiers, although many of them are white, affluent males, families that are better off, and very, very traditional Republicans. They've really been involved in Republican networks for a long time. I think that sense of economic insecurity did affect them. And one of the interesting things, too, is there are lots of people who vote for the Tea Party who are on public assistance. And they say they hate it. They say they hate it, and they want to be independent of the government. These are very low-income people. These are low-income people. I don't know how many there are, but there are some. And they're drawn to the Tea Party. They share that sense of economic insecurity, but they have a tendency to blame the government for their economic insecurity. They're not looking at globalization. They're not looking at monopoly. Now, the East India monopoly was very important. Consolidation of corporations. We've gone through waves of them. In the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, it's still going on. And machine technology is causing loss of jobs. And so those folks down in the bottom 20-25% of socioeconomic status, some of them, I don't know how many, but some of them are definitely feeling insecure. Oh my goodness, Washington Post did a poll. 60% of wage workers in this country are worried about losing their job. The poll was in 2012 or 2013. That's an amazing number. 60% are worried about losing their job. And of course,
That's fertile ground for a protest movement.
it's fertile grounds for a protest movement.
We haven't talked about race.
Yep.
Talk about race. Race in the current Tea Party, and was there any element of this back in the 18th century?
I don't see any element of it in the 18th century other than the fact that these were not people in the early 19th century and late 18th century were obviously not racial liberals. And slavery was ending in the North, but slavery was still eroding very slowly, even in the North. And most of the emancipation programs were graduate emancipation programs. Race is very important. I think that President Obama's election symbolizes a transforming nation demographically. A country that is becoming increasingly minority majority and will be in a decade or two. And the Tea Party, very much so, this Tea Party, is reacting to that. And the presence of many undocumented, 10, 11 million undocumented immigrants. Tea Party folks are extremely opposed to public assistance programs. And you saw what happened when Marco Rubio, who would like to run for president, suddenly became willing to consider a path to citizenship. He had to back off, or his prospects were dead. Race surveys have shown that Tea Party supporters, the core Tea Party supporters, they're now basically the voters who turn out in Republican primaries passionately, with or without some grassroots network existing. And they absolutely don't want public assistance going to undocumented immigrants. And they even, surveys done by political scientist Theda Skocpol and her colleagues discovered that they even resent assistance to their own children who might be living at home and are mooching off them, mooching off the government. And there's this very strong sort of anti-moocher. Now, they don't care about corporate welfare. They're not interested in that. They're not interested in some of the corporate sponsors of, like Walmart, for example. Walmart just admitted in its report to the SEC, January 31st, 2014, it just admitted that to its stockholders and shareholders and to the SEC that among all of the possible things that they could not control that might affect the profits of Walmart was cuts to public assistance programs, because they depend and they tell their workers. So does McDonald's. And if that's not mooching, I don't know what it is. What is? If McDonald's and Walmart aren't welfare queens, I don't know who is.
Thank you so much.
You're going to cut that last part, right?
No, why should I?